Everybody, welcome back to the Insider's Lounge. Today we have another episode and another special guest. Charlie, thank you for joining me, and feel free to give yourself a quick introduction here.
Crikey, Chad. Normally the host does that. Otherwise, it sounds like I'm blowing sunshine out of my own arse. I guess I'm a football executive. In recent years, chief executive of Charlton Athletic in London and Sunderland in the northeast of England. I've also been an advisor to various clubs, Arsenal, Spurs, along the way. And I've now just taken over a position as managing director of Mount Pleasant Football Academy in Jamaica.
Yeah, when I first started the podcast, it's funny you said that. I was always deciding back and forth between, do I introduce the guest? Do I let them introduce themselves? And I kind of like to hear it from yourself. That way we get to learn kind of through the episode more about you, through your journey and so on. I think one of the sort of key questions that I always like to ask right at the beginning is, what do we need to know about you and your upbringing in order to understand how you operate today? I think everyone has their kind of unique approach in terms of during their career and their kind of day-to-day work, but also just in terms of family life and everything else that you have going on. Can we get a little bit of insight into your journey and into your childhood and how you grew up, so we can have a better understanding of how you actually operate today?
Well, how I operate today mostly is in contradiction of how I grew up and was brought up, because I'm fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to be one of those people who sits on the turn of the generations, right? So I'm right at the tail end of the pre-digital generation. So I was born in 1976 and I finished university in 1997, right? So that's just before the popularization of the internet. So when I was at university, I was at Oxford University. If we wanted to contact another student, we put a message on a piece of paper and a guy ran it round at some point during that day to their college. He left it in a little pigeonhole for them, and then at some point that day that guy would pick it up and he'd write a response on a piece of paper, and it would come back the following day. It would take 2 days to organize to have a drink with a friend. Mobile phones were not easily accessible. They were very expensive in those days. So effectively I entered the working world in the old era, and the old era was very, very different to the new era that we are in right now. It was let's just say that a lot of the working practices from that era would be frowned upon in the current age, right? There was a lot of shouting, a lot of screaming, a fair amount of physicality, and frankly, an awful lot more hard work than there is today. You were expected to be there early in the morning. You were expected to stay there until you were told not to be there anymore. And if you didn't like it, you just lose your job. And you wouldn't have some like sort of review process with human resources. There was something called personnel, and you'd be sent along to personnel and get told that you were fired and that you were going to collect your cards and you get a month's notice, and that was about the end of it. And an awful lot has changed since then, much of it for the better. But effectively, what I found when I started my managerial career, which is actually in the journalism and public relations world, is that even in that time, I'm talking now about 2006 to 10, that I was already having to change what I thought to be an acceptable way of managing into a more modern way of managing. And that process has been ongoing ever since, right? Which is, there's no point in looking back and saying, well, things were better in those days or not as good in those days, etc. You have to live in the present, and you have to understand the environment you're in, and you have to understand that you need to get the best out of the people who you're managing. That's your job as a manager. And that's not going to work if you manage them as we were managed 30 years ago when I started my working life, age 20, 21. So to that degree, but prior to that, I went to boarding school. Again, the tail end of the tough era. It was right at the end of the last era where you could be beaten at school by the masters legally, and we were regularly. And so effectively, a lot of what I learned between the ages of 10 and 25, I've had to unlearn, right? Because that's not going to help me going forward. Probably the thing that I learned, which is difficult for people of subsequent generations to learn, is the art of communication. Because effectively email, which came along right at the end of that process, meant that a lot of people felt that they didn't really need to use the telephone and they didn't really need to meet people in person, that sending an email was going to be enough. And that has been a huge help for me in my career. And certainly something that differentiates me from most people who are only 5 or 6 years younger than me, but didn't grow up with a telephone in their hand at their desk. When I started work as a journalist, you'd have a telephone on your desk and a notepad, and there would be a computer of a sort, but it was basically an input computer, like a word processor, right? Where when you
Mm.
had to write something, you wrote it, but there was no point in sitting in front of your computer all day. There was nothing to do other than write something, right? So you spent much more time on the phone and much more time actually going and meeting people because you couldn't find stuff out otherwise. So that sort of art of communication, that skill of communication with other people and building relationships with other people is something I feel very grateful to have learned right at the start of my career, and something which is still serving me well to this day.
Yeah, I've never thought of that kind of transitional period, kind of graduating right on that 2000 mark. You really were in the transition of the sort of internet bubble to come, and the way communication changed in that time is truly transformational if you look at it in kind of the longer term sort of things. I'm curious, you spoke a little bit about your journalism, your kind of PR and publishing side, which is really where you started off your career. Can we get into that a little bit more? What was kind of the foot in the door moment? And how did that transition into the football side of things? Because I don't think at that time, were you expecting to one day work in football? Was that always a goal of yours?
Not at all. And again, that's something that's changed very much with the decades. Is that in those days football was not an industry. Even at the very top level, a friend of mine's father was chairman of Arsenal, and really the club was run by the club secretary, who's an administrator. And there was a commercial guy who sold some sponsorship, and there was a head of ticketing who sold some tickets. But basically, even Arsenal was a cottage industry, right? And it's hard to imagine these days. They still get a lot of people turning up on match day, but in terms of the rest of the operation, right? You had a club shop, no online retail. So for someone to buy something, they had to turn up to the club shop. You had some sponsorship, obviously front of shirt and billboards around the pitch. But other than that, not much inventory, right? Things like stadium sponsorship weren't a thing yet. That didn't exist at the time. And things just rolled along, really. So football was never, even though I was a very keen footballer and football fan growing up, football was never an option for me to work in. So the area that I chose to go into was horse racing, my other great love. I gambled full time for a year, then moved into horse racing journalism off the back of that. Obviously, wasn't that good at gambling, and from horse racing journalism, eventually moved into what I call proper journalism, normal journalism, political journalism, and then I ran a gossip column, but again, a lot of politics in that, and where my boss was Boris Johnson, the subsequent Prime Minister of the UK, and then when I felt that the internet was starting to eat print journalism, which I was correct, and I was quite early making that call. I made that call in 2004-5. So that's when I started to move into broader things, and eventually into communications consultancy, which is effectively a sort of fairly short jump from the media, because particularly in those days, a large chunk of your job on behalf of your clients was to help communicate with the media or through the media, whatever it might be. So you need to understand the media. But that was, I guess, my bridge into business, right? That was my bridge into sitting around a table with business people, business leaders, finding out what their objectives are or were, working out how I could help them, which in a fairly limited way when you're a PR guy, there's certain things you can do, but you're obviously not a management consultant or anything like that. But nonetheless, it did start me down the road of getting into business. And in fact, one of my early clients was Arsenal. And they were defending a hostile takeover attempt by the Russian billionaire Alisher Usmanov at the time, and I helped them PR-wise around that. And at the same time, I was helping McLaren Formula One with a PR matter as well. So I guess in a way, my background in sport, my interest in sport was already leading me to take on clients in sport because I found it more interesting. And perhaps because I knew a bit more about it. So when I was pitching for the business, probably compared to other PR consultants, I was a bit more knowledgeable about those things than some of the other PR guys were. And then it was 2 or 3 years down that track when I was a managing partner of a PR agency that my home club, my boyhood club, Oxford United, which had been in the top division in the 1980s, what's now the Premier League, was then called the First Division, but by this point had gone bust several times and had eventually fallen into what we call administration, and Americans call Chapter 11, and had fallen out of the whole league into the Fifth Division, semi-professional division. And some friends of mine bought the club, that persuaded their father to buy the club for £1. And they asked me to come and help them with it. To cut a long story short, I did. We had to try and put the whole club back together again. It took a long time. We made a lot of mistakes, but in a way, it was like a business school when it came to running a football club, right? Because you were watching away from the national media eye, in a club with some fans, but not hundreds of thousands of fans, with no sort of real sort of constant pressure always to say the right thing or do the right thing. So you start to work out how these clubs work, what the ecosystem is, how things fit together, how to deal with professional football people, how to build academies, how to set up women's teams, how to put in place new ticketing systems using digital technology, all of these things, right? I went into it not knowing anything about any of these things. And I came out of that experience 3 or 4 years down the track, having learned a lot about those things. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I'm also very proud of the fact that Oxford today is in the Championship, which is England's second division. And that feels like a huge achievement given where the club had got to 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago now. And that was my entree into working in football. And shortly afterwards, two guys who I knew from the business world asked me to try and find them a football club. They were probably thinking about something about the same size as Oxford, sort of medium-sized club. But for whatever reason, the club that came up was Sunderland. It was in a hell of a mess, but it was obviously a potentially prize asset. And the rest is, as they say, history. That was a crazy 3 or 4 year period turning around Sunderland. Again, very proud of the fact that they stand right now on the brink of the playoff final to get back in the Premier League just 6 years later. And that 3 or 4 years was very intense, very difficult, ultimately very gratifying in the end, but with a lot of difficult things along the way. Moving to a different part of the country. And for those who don't know the UK, whilst the distances are quite short, the differences are quite large, right? So you might be only 4 or 5 hours between London and Sunderland, but you might as well be, 500 hours. It's a very, very different culture, very different place, and takes a lot of getting to know. And it's not an easy environment for somebody from the south to work in. So anyhow, we sold that club after it got promoted to the Championship, and I vowed never to work in football again. And then a year later, I found myself going back to Charlton again. Bought a club on behalf of a couple of wealthy American guys. They wanted a London club. Bought Charlton again in a bad way, in need of turnaround. Fortunately, I think we've been able to largely do that. They're in the playoffs now. Again, favourites to go up via the playoffs, and hopefully they will. That's been the last couple of years. And then I was offered the opportunity to go to Jamaica. And I've always wanted to work abroad, and I see huge opportunity in the Caribbean football talent pool. And that was an opportunity which I felt might not come around again. So I've taken that opportunity, and I'm now the managing director of the leading club in the Caribbean region.
Yeah, I think a fantastic overview, and in terms of a career, quite a unique journey of its own in terms of the different clubs that you've been able to work for. You mentioned with Oxford United, it almost became like a business school for you. You were able to learn all the different aspects of the club, how to grow a club, the academy, all the different points of impact in terms of what a club actually is. Can you break down what's your viewpoint of like a standard education in terms of university or college or the equivalent in the UK versus kind of that hands-on experience? I know you were kind of able to have both, and so I'm curious the differences between the two and how you were able to, I don't know, maybe just learn different aspects of the business industry as a whole and the footballing industry as well.
Yeah, I mean, I did it in a very idiosyncratic way, and I was coming into the game when it was just starting to become a bit more professional, I guess. In other words, it was starting to attract, as more money came into the Premier League, the people who bought Premier League clubs for a lot of money started to feel, well, I want to have a chief executive who I think is good. So you started to see some slightly more professional people come into the game, and that started to gradually drip its way down. I mean, very slowly, and still probably hasn't entirely happened yet. But there wasn't, at that point in time, there was not a standardized way of getting into football, right? So the people who ran football clubs 15 years ago, generally speaking, were guys who left school at 16 or 18, went to work for their local club in the ticket office, spent 2 or 3 years in the ticket office, moved to the marketing department, spent 2 years in the marketing department, then spent 2 or 3 years running the shop, then another 3 years being the head of commercial sales. Maybe they moved club in the meantime, whatever. But basically, it was a sort of cottage industry where a very small number of people rotated around the clubs with very similar backgrounds. Some of them had maybe done a bookkeeping course. Maybe one or two of them were originally lawyers of some kind. But generally speaking, it was a fairly mid to low end type career path, mostly of people who came from a sort of fairly working class background, but who were really passionate about this game and decided that whatever they were going to do, they were going to work in it. So even though working in the ticket office might be very boring for a lot of people, if you're a super fan, maybe it's not. You're close to the club you love, and so on and so forth. That's really not the case anymore, right? So, I've just joined the board of something called the Global Institute of Sport, which is precisely preparing people to work in the sports industry and the football industry with a mixture of academic education and hands-on vocational experience as well. And that is going to be that the next generation is just going to be different. The next generation is going to be built off people who actually genuinely want to work in the sports industry and who could have worked in the law or in management consultancy or whatever it might be. Because you know what? That some of these jobs now, they pay really well. If you end up becoming chief executive of a Premier League club, you're going to really do extremely well for yourself financially. So it's now a viable career. As I said, when I first came into the working world, the only two sports that were really proper industries were motor racing and horse racing. They're the ones with a scale and a number of jobs, because they're both effectively linked to broader things, right? So the Formula One business is linked to innovation in automotive engineering, and horse racing is linked into the bloodstock industry, which is a massive multi-billion-pound industry. So that's why historically there have been careers and money and sort of industry kind of feel to those sports. Football's just about getting there now, right? But it's taken a long, long time. And I think that now the next generation will be in a much better position. In fact, already are in a much, much better position to be able to get that educational mix of vocation and academics at a stage in their life which is early enough to enable them to then have a proper career.
Yeah, I think that's a spot on approach. I wanted to, before we get into kind of the Mount Pleasant and the current project, I wanted to quickly dive into Sunderland and Charlton as well. I think if we just take the two together and we break down sort of the from the very early stages of I guess you could start with the discovery phase in terms of actually looking for a club. Why did the two different ownership groups look for those clubs specifically? Why did those end up working out as the clubs that they were going to take that next step with? And then if you just want to kind of give a little bit of I know you already sort of did, but a little bit of an overview in terms of your time there, kind of the situation and where they're at now. I know obviously doing much better in both situations. And then we'll get into Mount Pleasant and the current project in a more broad way.
So generally speaking, professional football clubs come on the market mostly because they're failing. Mostly. There are some examples, and in fact we have been examples of this, where you succeed, get promoted, and then decide now's the right time to sell, right? But generally speaking, most football club owners are not professional industry people, don't really get it, don't really understand it, and they hang on to it when things are going well, and they want to sell when things are going badly. So they end up generally buying high or selling low, whatever, just getting the whole thing wrong because it's not their industry. So the moment when bargains become available is when a club with potential has been failing for some time and has become toxic and unpleasant for the owner. Because in European football, if your club's doing badly, you will know about it from your fans, right? And that's not just a bit of booing at the end of a match. That can be quite a lot more invasive than that, right? It can start to actually affect every area of your life if you are the owner of a football club that is doing persistently badly. And I'm not to say that that's right or wrong. It's actually wrong, but it doesn't matter because it's just a fact. And these wealthy guys who have been successful in other industries tend to throw the towel in at that point, right? Because their egos won't let them say, "I got it wrong. I'm sorry. We're gonna improve. Or we're gonna do something different, or whatever it might be." That whole shtick is based on, I know better than everybody else, and I know what I'm doing, and I'm coming into football to show everybody else the way it's done. And then when it doesn't work out that way, they just get out. They just get out, and then in subsequent, normally they sort of blame other things for why the whole thing went wrong or whatever it might be. So those tend to be the best buys, right? Which is a club that has good infrastructure, a big fan base, a good history, but which is on its arse, losing more money than it should, but is susceptible to a more professional approach and a turnaround type sort of situation to get things back on the right track, right? Because you can do all the right things, but if the club doesn't really have any scope, if it doesn't have any revenues, doesn't have enough fans, that even if you do get things right, stuff doesn't necessarily happen, right? And that would be, very frustrating. And I've seen examples of that, of people who have bought those types of clubs who have got it right. And you think, well, why aren't more fans coming? Well, look, you haven't looked at your catchment area. You haven't analysed the situation correctly. So in both instances, my judgment was that the club was a good buy at the price, and it had the potential to go at least one, if not two divisions higher. And probably it hit about as far down the food chain as it possibly could get, right? So the old expression, the only way is up. Now, for me to say, I'm going to talk about what happened, I mean, it would take 3 podcasts to talk about what happened at Sunderland, and it would take 2 podcasts to talk about what's happened at Charlton. Like, you're going to have to ask me some questions which satisfy your curiosity about those 2 things. So those 2 were very similar. Different characters of club, in terms of the fan base, very, very different types of people, but same situation. Big club, former Premier League club, fallen down the divisions, everyone unhappy, things not being done right behind the scenes, in need of a lot of attention, love, and a thick skin to get through the turnaround phase, because fans ultimately just shout at you, just sign a striker, fire the manager, just whatever, right? And you have to be clear internally that you are going to turn it round the right way, not just be the next idiot on the track who says we're going to do what the fans say. So that period, that first year of the turnaround, the first year to year and a half, the turnaround is a very difficult, painful time, because effectively you are undoing the mistakes and paying for the mistakes that were made in the 3 years prior to you arriving. But at that point, you're not going to see the result of that work yet on the pitch, right? The best you can hope for is just to hold things steady, maybe a tiny small improvement of some kind, maybe, but whilst you're sorting out the mess, it's not automatically easily going to get better, particularly not if you're sorting it out in a systematic way. So, as I said, it's a very, very tough time. And then you kind of know at some point we've got most things right here now. Things should be right, and yet the results haven't turned, and that's a very nervous time. And then suddenly there's a moment when it all clicks, and everything suddenly, and then the first team starts winning every week. And you're never quite sure when that moment's going to arrive or what's going to prompt it, etc. Why? It's like an alchemy. It's not, that moment is not predictable. That moment is unpredictable, and that can be very nervous. You're like sat there watching the team not do very well when you know it should be doing well, and you have to try and just resist all of the urges that the fans, again, fire the manager, hire a striker, whatever. And you've got to trust that actually things are being done the right way, and they will turn at some point. So that's basically the story of both of those 2 clubs.
And I would say the biggest difference between the 2, maybe from an outsider's perspective, is obviously Sunderland having the TV show around it. I would say just it was a more public display of, okay, this is what's happening at the club. What were was that magnified? Were those issues? Because I think you mentioned the idea that fans are very vocal. They're saying, okay, fire the manager, get this striker, do this, do that. But I think when you have a show around that and it's just being blasted out there on right across media.
Don't forget that the show doesn't come out until much later, right? So the show which, demonstrated the 2018, 2019 season didn't come out for a year subsequent, right? By which point it was all out of date because, all the Sunderland fans knew that was old history, right? The rest of the world maybe didn't because maybe they don't follow Sunderland, so it was just entertaining TV for them. But it was largely outdated by then. So I don't think the Netflix thing really had any bearing on the type of task involved. I think what probably did have a bearing was very different types of people. They're both big clubs. Charlton's fan base, as measured recently by one big firm, is the wealthiest fan base by head count in the country. It's the closest club to the City of London and Canary Wharf. A lot of their fans work in finance and are, it's kind of the equivalent of people from Brooklyn or the Bronx or something. It's inner city, but it's quite streetwise, right? So we've got a lot of people there who understand money, who understand business, and who can read balance sheets and who understand what a turnaround means, what it looks like. And they can be quite critical of you from a business perspective. Like, I've been looking, why aren't the revenues higher? Why is the club shop not being run in a particular way? All this type of stuff. And in some ways that's difficult. On the other hand, actually, it's quite straightforward because you're dealing with reason. You're dealing with rationale, right? So they want their club to be better, but particularly they want their club to be better in areas that they kind of understand, right? Which is business, commerce, finance, etc. And they'll haul you up if you don't show enough energy or imagination or innovation in those things. But equally, they are perhaps more understanding of the reality of what a turnaround looks like and what it means, right? That it's not, you don't click your fingers and everything happens overnight and suddenly the sun's shining and you win every game. At Sunderland, you've got a very passionate fan base who, you can't characterize a fan base as big as that and saying they're all this or all that, but probably a fairly significant portion are in the armed forces, fairly significant portion still work in factories or for the public sector. It's not going to be as interested in the ins and outs of how the football business or the football industry works. It wants success. It wants it now. And if it doesn't get it, it's going to shout and scream very loudly about it. And then if you do get it, then there'll become huge joy, huge celebration, and huge jubilation. You sort of swing between the two, right? Which can make it quite difficult keeping everything on an even keel inside the club, right? So, we're dealing with often young humans, whether it be the players or some of the people who work in the office, etc., who are living in this community. Everyone in that community knows that they work for the club or they play for the club. So they are receiving, let's say, intense feedback on a constant basis, which at times can be very upsetting feedback and quite sometimes very derogatory feedback. And it's an expression of pain and it's an expression of hurt that's being visited on a bunch of young humans who are simply trying to do their best, really, right? So that is what made it different. That atmosphere, that ecosystem is what made it different compared to the more steady, measured approach of Charlton and its fan base sitting down for detailed meetings with the supporters trust and they want to know everything and you can give them everything and it'll be treated with respect, and they won't sort of go and write about it on chat rooms or this type of stuff, but the whole thing will be done quite in a sensible, mature way. So I think that why has the turnaround at Charlton happened quicker? The turnaround at Charlton has happened quicker, I think, probably because I knew a bit more this time than the last time.
Yeah.
But secondly, because the ecosystem is healthier. the ecosystem is more conducive to a group of young people feeling empowered to improve, to come together and to produce something going forward. And I think what you see with Sunderland and Newcastle is that when the train is heading in the right direction, it's unbelievably powerful, right? Because then everybody really gets on board.
Yeah.
But when things are not heading in the right direction, either heading in the wrong direction or not yet heading in the right direction, it can act like quite a drag and quite a brake on trying to affect the kind of cultural turnaround that you need.
And with both of those, in kind of those turnover periods where that was the reason you came in, what was the key motivation to keep you going? Because I know, like you mentioned, a lot of operators will come in, they'll realize things aren't clicking the way they wanted to, and then all of a sudden they'll jump ship. What for you, whether it was your family or others in your circle or just other circumstances that you had that kind of kept you motivated and kept you going in those times?
I don't think other operators jump ship. I'm talking really about owners. That certain owners, most owners don't take on those types of clubs, right? And rightly so, because it's hard enough running a football club when it's already in an okay state. Running a football club when it's broken is really super challenging, really, really challenging, because these types of businesses normally get turned around well away from the public eye in normal industries. And you can do all the things that you need to be able to do, mass redundancies, sorting out IT systems, tweaking the product, changing the brand a bit, etc. You can do all that kind of stuff without anyone really noticing or doing anything about it. In football, you're doing it all in the public eye, right? So most new football owners don't naturally take on those types of projects. They prefer to take on a club that's doing well, if they can. And they're almost willing to pay more for that than risk taking on the club that seems like no one can ever get it right. So I take it on knowing, because I've done 3 of them, I know how difficult it is. And I know it's going to take 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years, whatever it might be. So I think the question would be, well, what might happen if at one of these clubs, like, the turnaround didn't work, right? And 2 to 3 years in, you're still basically, in a worse place than you were when you started, which is not something I say lightly. Like when Alex Ferguson took over Man United, that happened to him. Alex Ferguson took over Man United and they'd been under, Ron Atkinson and co. They'd been a sort of upper mid-table top division team, and they actually got worse under Fergie before they got better. Such was the level of the turnaround required that it really took 3 to 4 years before he managed to really get the whole thing working in the right direction. And that, I think, because Fergie's a genius, and I think that demonstrates how difficult this is. This is not as easy as fans think. This is tough. And you've got to be in it for the medium haul. You've got to really believe in it, and you've got to take great pride in it, and you've got to really want the outcome. You've got to want to get to that point where you can look back and say, yeah, I was part of that. I was a key part of sorting that place out. And now there are lots of really happy people. Like, Sunderland will be playing against Coventry tonight in the Championship playoff semi-final, and there'll be a packed Stadium of Light, really massive atmosphere with people all around the world watching it, etc., etc. Now, 6 years ago, just before we took it over, it was in the Championship, finished last, with an average attendance of 21,000. And everyone was pissed off, unhappy. The stadium was dilapidated. Now stadium's in a great shape. It's debt-free. Great players could really go to the Premier League this year. 50,000 will be in the Stadium of Light. And you go, well, that's why. That's why you stick with it. And that's the satisfaction you take when you see that and you go, I know what it was and I know where it is now. And you have to take your own satisfaction in that.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I want to get into the transition to Mount Pleasant, because I know at least when we first spoke about it and you first mentioned it, it's like a bit of a shock. You're always in English football, and then all of a sudden the shift to the Jamaican side of things. I'd love to hear kind of how that opportunity came about and why you felt that was the next step for you, that you felt that was the kind of the next place you wanted to take your career.
I've always wanted to work abroad. And it almost happened for me twice when I was a journalist. I was going to go to Latin America at one point, and for one reason or another didn't. I was going to go to New York at one point, for one reason or another didn't. And it sort of stuck with me. Now, I've had patches working abroad as a PR consultant, a month in Africa here, a month in the Middle East there. But that's very different from moving somewhere, right? And actually committing to that place and having to learn that culture. And it's just a life experience. My parents, when I was very young, lived in Hong Kong. And it's something which, even now, is such a large part of their psyche that they lived in Hong Kong together, made a life in a different part of the world together. The memories they have from there, the friends that they made there, is just different from the rest of their life. The rest of their life has been spent in Oxfordshire in England. And I think that's always stuck with me. I've always wanted to work abroad. So when the opportunity came up, that was definitely a big part of it. The other part of it is that I've become more and more convinced in the last 5 to 10 years that with the datafication of playing performance, it's become the market of established players from established geographies has become very pure, and it's becoming very difficult to find what you might call good value players, right? So therefore, if you want to improve as a club, yes, all the stuff I've said before about getting everything behind the scenes right is all very important, but you reach a certain point, maybe the point that Sunderland's been at for the last year or so, where that's not enough, right? Because there are other clubs who want that place in the Premier League, who also have good performance departments, who also have good recruitment departments, and they're all looking at the same data. So you're just competing for the same player. And ultimately, whoever pays the most wins. That's the way it goes. And sure, you might make more or fewer bad judgments than a club that's not being as well run. You might waste less money, but it's still going to be very, very expensive, right? Unless you develop the players yourself. And, that's something which I think it both gives you a cheaper player in the short run, because the first contract or 2 contracts of a player's career will be on lower money than the established players. But secondly, of course, it means that you're then a seller in the market when that player moves on rather than a buyer in the market. So that then when you do go and become a buyer in the market, you're using funds which have been generated through the sale of your own players. And I don't think that really there is almost any club, probably Charlton's about the closest to it, Palace maybe, because they're both in South London and they've both got access to the African Caribbean communities, which is where the predominant DNA pool is for elite football. Other than those clubs, I just don't see other clubs in the English ecosystem who have really committed to it and who really understand that without that, they're going to lose a lot of money. And I'm not saying that you have to have 11 youth players in your team. I'm talking about committing to it sufficiently that you really start to think about, well, where do these players come from? Who are they? The reality is of the current England national team, of the national squad, there are 23 outfield players, of whom 13 are of Caribbean origin. So 60% of the England squad comes from 1% of our population, right? Now, it could be a massive coincidence. It could be a massive coincidence that Caribbean origin English people are 95 times more likely to become Premier League footballers than white English people. It could be. I could be totally wrong. I don't think I am. I think that there are physiological reasons why the African Caribbean communities, and particularly the Caribbean communities, are supplying a totally disproportionate number of Super League players. And that's not just England. If you look at the Dutch national team, again, more than 50% of their outfield players are originally from Suriname or Curacao. You look at Virgil van Dijk and Kluivert and all of these guys, all families are from Suriname and Curacao, and that's a tiny proportion of the Dutch population. You look at France, Thierry Henry and Lacazette and everyone, all these types of people, all from Guadeloupe and Martinique, tiny, tiny places. So I find the prospect of running the only professional academy in the entire Caribbean region a really, really interesting project, because every sort of statistical and analytical bone in my body is telling me that this should be the greatest football talent pool, elite talent pool in the world. And that if it is, and if we are the only people who are seriously playing in that market, that we will be in a very interesting position.
And what does that project look like in terms of where do you see those key points that you're able to either improve or innovate in certain spaces? Like you mentioned, data and scouting and the recruitment side of things at the elite level in Europe has kind of become, like you said, it's very pure.
Yeah, we're looking at an undatified market, right? So when Mount Pleasant take a 15, 16-year-old out of Haiti, there's no data on that player, right? So your scouting needs to be very, very good. But if you are the only professional academy in the region, as Mount Pleasant is, your scouting doesn't need to be quite as good, right? Because you're pretty much taking the cream of the crop. You're taking the ones who play for their national under-17 teams of the Haiti under-17 team that has qualified for the under-17 World Cup in Qatar this coming November. I think Mount Pleasant has 6 of the 10 outfield starters in that side. So I think that they're in a great place. The question is, okay, how can you keep on professionalizing to try to bring that academy up to equivalent levels of professionalization as what would be the case in Europe or Latin America, right? So that basically you're giving the talent, the raw DNA talent, you're giving it the equal opportunity that it would be given in a different part of the world, as their cousins would be, for instance, in the clubs in Southeast London, which is, where I sit right now. So that's just an interesting challenge. And the second big challenge is, how do you move those players from the Caribbean region to major football geographies, given all the various different visa systems? That's another big challenge, which, has to be dealt with in a professional way. And then the third really interesting area is actually the first team. The Mount Pleasant first team is just won the Jamaica Premier League season by pushing 20 points. Now it has to win the playoffs, which is a different challenge. As in American sports, winning the league doesn't win you anything. But the first team's getting it into an interesting place where if it achieves what it should achieve, then it will qualify for the last 16 of the Concacaf Champions Cup. And that's a place where, as happened with Cavalier from Kingston a month or two ago, they were playing against Inter Miami in front of 45,000 people in the National Stadium in Kingston with Messi and Suarez scoring the 2 goals. It's just as likely that Mount Pleasant will end up playing Cruz Azul away in the Azteca in front of 100,000 people. And of course, that tournament in turn is a feeder tournament into the FIFA Club World Cup. So there's a long way to go. But the Mount Pleasant first team is on a very progressive trajectory. A lot of the young players are coming into that team to improve it and give it extra quality and energy, etc. And I think that that's another interesting part of the project is, North America, where you sit, Central America and the Caribbean is a progressive football part of the world where things are happening, not all happening at once, but happening. There, I think you will see that in Canada and North America. Mexico's always been a powerful football geography, but certainly the Caribbean is becoming more and more powerful. And I think being a part of that is just really interesting. It's fascinating. It's a different world to the world I'm used to, as you said. 15 years of running clubs in, the second and third, fourth divisions of English football is a different world. And it's one which I'm really looking forward to embracing.
You mentioned one of the key parts of that is obviously building up the players in terms of the academy and the first team, but then moving those players on. What does that pathway look like? You mentioned the visas, and I know it's extremely difficult getting into the UK. Is that going to the US and then abroad into Europe? What have you found are the sort of key pathways for Jamaican players?
I think I'd have to say watch this space, right? That's something which I'm working on right now. There are a number of different ways to cut the cake. It's something that we have to decide on. It probably won't be just one way. We probably need to have 2 or 3 ways open to us for different types of profile of player, etc. But it's not something which we're yet in a position to to really lay out there and for public scrutiny.
And I think from your side of things, if we look at off the field, so that what I would say is all very sporting related. If we look at off the field, you obviously have experience right across the board in terms of communications, PR, journalism, but also just operating football clubs from that kind of business commercial perspective. What are some of the improvements or ways? Like, I'm sure there's just so much difference in the way clubs are operated. I would love to hear from your side. What are those differences, and where do you see that like improvements can be made, or maybe they're even doing things that aren't seen in the Premier League, for example, or in the EFL in general, in terms of the way they do something that might be much different than the European side?
I think that the biggest thing that needs to happen is that we need to have cost controls, right? Is at the moment, a lot of us are very frustrated, and you're running a club, an organization, a business which is operating in an unsustainable way, but it's not your fault. I mean, it's you're land with a Hobbes's choice, where you either run yourself sustainably and don't compete, or you run yourself unsustainably and do compete. It's very, very, very difficult to both be sustainable and competitive, and that's just wrong. I mean, all that leads to is inflation in the player wage market. There's no point to it. There's no existential point to it. Players are very well paid anyway. It's not like 40 years ago when they were poorly paid and perhaps increasing their wages had a social good to it. That's not the difference between a player earning 5 million a year and 8 million a year is just not. You can't cast that as being a social good. That's just putting clubs and fans' hearts and dreams at risk for something which is so. That's something which is gradually being addressed. UEFA have addressed it. Now various national leagues are addressing it. The reality of leagues outside the Premier League gradually receiving less TV money is also going to regulate it. So all of these things together, I hope, will lead to European football becoming more sustainable. Because really the way it is at the moment is no fun as a business person to operate it. As a business person, you want to operate a good business. You don't want to operate a bad business. At the same time, you're fully aware of what the aspirations of your owners and the fans are. And if you simply say, well, we're just going to cut the budgets because I want to try and make the sums add up, you end up in a worse situation, which is everyone, losing money for a different way, which is people not turning up, people not wanting to buy merchandise, and you end up in the same place, just with a less happy atmosphere. So that's the massive thing. Part of the sustainability of the future is, I think, understanding how to grow a digital audience alongside your historic audience. And Sunderland Till I Die and Wrexham, and then a few digital pure plays have proven that you can grow a digital audience. You can grow a significant number of people around the world who take an interest in your club because the content that you produce is sufficiently engaging, and the brand narrative is sufficiently interesting to those particular people. You don't need all the people. You only need some of the people. So I think that's going to be a really interesting trend of the next few years, is more people looking at, I could take a club that theoretically is quite small and I could potentially turn it into something a lot bigger. Just by being smart about what a certain portion of the global digital audience might be interested in. We've got to be honest that YouTube is the dominant platform now. So it's a global dominant platform in a way that we've never had before. So if you can crack a certain YouTube audience for a certain type of product, and if you can get those people following the club that you're running, you're going to be able to monetize that in a number of different ways. And we're seeing that through Wrexham, right? Now, obviously, they had certain assistance. Having a major Hollywood star involved definitely helps, but it's not the only way. There's a club in this country called #United that starts a pure YouTube play. They've actually come up the semi-professional pyramid, just funding themselves through this way. And I don't think it's implausible in the next 2 to 3 years that there'll be a professional club, and they don't have almost any historic audience at all. None, literally none. It's all a digital audience. So I think these are going to be the interesting plays of the next few years, together with, as I say, an understanding that the development of your own players needs to be looked at more closely. I think a lot of clubs pay lip service to it at the moment. Yeah, we've got an academy. Yeah, we try and give local kids a chance. That's not going to be good enough. You're going to have to be a lot smarter about how you manage to get your hands on the best global young talent early. And that's going to be another thing of the next few years, I think.
And I like the mention of the digital side of things, because I would say in Canada, I'm not too far from Toronto, and it's a huge Jamaican hub. Like, we had Canada play the Jamaican national team, and there was more Jamaican fans there than Canadian fans. So I think you have the passionate fan base. It's just about turning maybe generalized fans in terms of national team fans into club fans, and then bringing them onto the digital platforms like YouTube and so on. And I think that potential is there, which is extremely exciting. The other question I had was around the regional competitions as a whole. So if you take like the Concacaf Champions Cup, for example, do you think these sort of competitions are the current structure is allows for Caribbean teams to really make the most of them? I know, like, for example, if you can do well in the Champions Cup, there's always the opportunity for the Club World Cup and so on. Do you see these current structures exciting?
Honestly, Chad, I think it's absolutely transformational for a Caribbean team to have a realistic chance of playing Cruz Azul, one of the top clubs in the world, in the Azteca. I think that's transformational. I mean, if I look at our country, only a tiny number of the very biggest clubs would have that opportunity in anything that they did, right? So what's the biggest aspiration for Charlton? Being realistic. Well, to get them promoted to the Championship, to stabilise them in the Championship, to hope that they then start punching above their weight in the Championship, to hope that at some point they sneak through into the Premier League, to hope that when they do sneak through in the Premier League, they somehow manage to stay up for the first season, and to hope, right, you play it through a long way before you eventually say, and they might eventually get into the Europa Conference League by finishing 8th in the Premier League or something like that, right? And that's not unrealistic, but it's some years down the track. You're talking about 7-8 years of good decisions, significant investment, and all this type of stuff. What we're looking at with Mount Pleasant and other of the big Caribbean clubs, in Kingston and Montego Bay, is the opportunity within the next 6 months, a year, 18 months to be playing against some of the biggest clubs in the world. Playing against Messi and Suarez in Miami. I know it's a new club, but it's still a massive deal. It's a huge deal to be playing a club game against a competitive club game against Lionel Messi in front of an international global audience. So I think that the new structure with the Caribbean Cup leading into the Concacaf Champions Cup and the Concacaf Champions Cup leading into the FIFA Club World Cup is a phenomenal opportunity for the top Caribbean clubs, by which we basically mostly mean the Jamaican clubs, because that's the really more senior professional league in the Caribbean. And particularly with Haiti being in a difficult place right now. So I'm very excited about it. And I think that it's going to lead to people looking at the bigger clubs from that region in a slightly different way, I think, as being, potential vehicles for some really interesting stories and trajectories and outcomes, etc. But, there are still a lot of matches that have got to be played and won. Sport is not played on paper, it's played on grass, as they say. And, we at Mount Pleasant are going to have to win those matches in order to be able to tell that story.
I've got a couple quick fire questions to wrap up the episode here. The first one, I asked about your motivation during your times at Charlton and Sunderland. I'm curious your motivation now in this next chapter of your career. What would you say has changed in terms of that motivation? Do you have something that's really driving you to kind of carry on?
I don't need anything to drive me to carry on this one. And it's a lot of excitement, as I said, both around what can be achieved with the academy and what can be achieved with the first team. I never really find motivation difficult anyway, Chad, if I'm being honest with you. I'm lucky in that I don't find it difficult to motivate myself to go out on a run. I don't find it difficult to motivate myself to, drive and see, an old friend. I don't find it difficult to motivate myself to go and work hard to try and help a football club. I've got many other issues where I'm substandard in many ways. I said earlier on about my struggles with modern management methods, but motivation's not a problem for me. I'm a very motivated person, and this is, something which I think would motivate even somebody who wasn't necessarily all that motivated.
Yeah, well said. If there's you've had a ton of experience right across the board in terms of the footballing industry, working with club owners, being an operator, and also constant communication with the fans as well. What would you say is the biggest disconnect between club owners and operators and the fans themselves?
Well, I mean, very significant disconnects. Very, very significant disconnects because the reality. So, like with all products, the fans see the end product, right? So, I've got a can of Coke in front of me. I see that product, but I don't see anything that went into the making of that can. Like, where is that factory? How much work had to go into that factory? What are the processes in that factory that make sure those fans get turned out in the same way every time? How much work's got into that branding over the last few decades? How they make sure the taste is the same every time? How they keep that brand consistency, right? I don't even think about all that stuff. I just buy a can of Coke and I drink a can of Coke, right? And I like it, and I buy one again, or whatever it might be. And likewise, fans don't tend to think, or when they do think, they only have a small part of the picture about what ends up on the pitch, why it ends up in a certain way, why their team gets more injuries than another team, why they get more players suspended than another team, why certain players who've done well for other clubs don't do well for their club, why they seem to have a higher turnover of managers for another club. They don't really understand any of this, and it all lands back at buy a striker, sack the manager, right? And that's natural, right? Because that's the only thing that you can see. You can't expect people to guess at all the complexities involved in the performance department in terms of getting players fit and keeping them fit. They don't have that information. They never worked in professional sport. Why should they know that? So I don't decry it, but it does mean that there is a profound disconnect between what the fans think is important and what is important in terms of achieving success, I'm saying. Of course, they believe that the soul of the club is important, and they're right. They believe in retaining the same colours, and they're right. They believe in the club being, having a social soul, and they're right. They believe in the club giving an opportunity to young talent, and they're right. So there's lots of stuff that fans instinctively know and are correct about. It's their club, they get it. But the bit that they can't understand and will never know, will never accommodate themselves to, is that the actual process of getting it right on the pitch is formidably complex. And that for the very best reasons in the world, they will never have the knowledge to understand it. And that therefore, there's no point in shouting and screaming for another striker or firing the manager, because that's in all probability not really what's going on. And if you see what's happened at Man United in the last 10 years, 15 years since Fergie left, you'll see that they've signed lots of new strikers and they've fired lots of managers. And none of those things have been the thing which have turned things round, because everything else is wrong. And it's the everything else which is the important bit. So, in other words, if you've got everything else right, then Erik ten Hag is a good manager. Right? If you've got everything else right, then whoever the striker happens to be at that time is a good striker. He hasn't become a Man United striker by being a bad footballer. That just doesn't happen, right? The reason he's not scoring goals is not because he's bad. It's because everything else is wrong, right? And that is a difficult, tough message that is the biggest and profoundest disconnect between those who work in football and those who watch it. Just the same as it is in restaurants between those who work in the kitchen and those who eat the food out the front of the kitchen. Probably the difference is that people who watch football both feel entitled to, which they are, a strong view on it, but also feel in some ways that their view is as valid as the people who do work in the game, which I'm afraid to say, in my professional experience, it just isn't.
Yeah, I think that topic as a whole could be like you said previously, a whole nother episode on itself. I think it's quite a controversial, not necessarily controversial, but a big topic of discussion in the football industry, but right across the board in terms of business as well. The last one that we have here for you, if you could sit down with one person for a meal, past or present, who would it be and why?
Is this somebody in the sports industry?
It can be sports or anything general as well.
I mean, when I was a young journalist, I interviewed Brian Clough, who's pretty inarguably the greatest manager that England has ever produced. And my memories of that interview are very profound. And any extra time I would get to spend with Brian Clough would be time well spent. He was a fascinating guy, who was able, despite being a former professional footballer, was able to think originally about the whole business and the whole setup of the sport. Like, he was barely even a manager in the way that we would understand today. He was more like a sporting director, right? And he would think about the entire setup of the club and everything around it. That's why he got very impatient with some owners, because he was like, look, I'm running your club. I am running your club. I'm not here just to coach the players on the pitch. I am here to run your club, and I will do that, and I will turn your club into European champions. But I need to run your club, and I think he was so far ahead of his time that it's just extraordinary, right? Everything that he was thinking, coaching wise, recruitment wise, in terms of the overall management of a squad of players, he was just somebody who was an innovator and someone who I found fascinating for the time I did speak with him, and would always want to spend any time with him if he was still around again.
Yeah, that's a good one and a good way to wrap up the episode. Charlie, if you have any last words, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate your time. Any last words from your end, and then we can wrap things up.
No, that's great. Thanks very much, Chad. Really good to chat.
Appreciate it. Have a good one, Charlie. See you.
Thank you.